What is that value of that home selling today versus that home selling 3 months from now? Because you're going to have other expenses. Not only are you going to have inflation chipping away at your money, care about your cash on cash return. One of the other metrics that comes up quite often for me day to day with my clients is they care about their cash on cash return. Use something like the 50% rule, and that's the estimate of your operating expenses. Generally, the rule of thumb is that whatever the cost of the item is, it's about that same cost to have it installed. How do you identify what's a good deal if you're investing in real estate, and how do you decide what's a bad deal investing in real estate? There's also so many different terms. What do they all mean, and what does it look like from an overview? Not getting nitty gritty into each property specifically, but the overall fundamentals that you can carry with you, whether this is your first deal or your 100th, and how to look at it. So we're gonna go over a few different things, specifically some terms, some metrics, some other terms, an estimate, and then the key questions to kind of ask yourself. So we're gonna start out with some of the fundamentals first. Cash flow. Cash flow is your pre-tax dollars. That's the money that you bring in. Think of whatever you're bringing in, that's your cash flow. People love using the word cash flow all the time because it's also changes throughout time, where it's a flow, it's a rate. What you get right now might not be what you get later. So when people talk about cash flow purposes, spreading a purchase out, maybe they don't buy it all at one time, they spread it throughout the year due to cash flow. That's what that means. Debt service is basically your mortgage payment. So there's some times where people like using middle management language to make themselves feel a little better, let you know that they're in with the niche lingo, whatever. Yeah. And the thing is, it makes sense. You're servicing your debt service instead of a mortgage payment, whatever. One of the key concepts is the time value of money, and that money now is worth more than money in the future. And you know that, but why is that? One of the things is $1,000 today is more valuable than $1,000 in 1 year, because you can invest that money now versus you get it in a year. You have to wait, miss out on those potential gains from the investment, and you're missing out due to inflation, where money doubles in value every 25 years or so. That's a good rate of inflation. So you're also taking proportionally less money if you get it a year from now versus right now. And $1,000 is enough to where you can kind of wrap your head around that. At least I could. If I'm thinking about $100 now versus a year from now, of course I want the money now, but this is large enough to where it's not just whatever. You get the point. We're gonna move on from these terms right now and jump over here. One of the other terms is CapEx, and your CapEx expenses. That's your capital expenditures. Think of that like the hard items on your house. What are the things that can be replaced? They're not personal property. It's your roof, it's your appliances, your water heater, your carpet, drywall, etc. Those are the things that are those capital expenditures. And if you're looking at a house, that's something to value in purchasing of a home. What CapEx improvements have there been recently? Is there a new roof? Is there a new water heater? Is there a new whatever? You can then look at that and discount back whatever the purchase price of that home might be. Where if you have two identical houses, but one has a brand new roof and one has an old roof, what is that value of the roof? Okay, let's say it's $20,000. And then that roof is I forget what I said, but 15 years old versus a brand new one. An average life of a roof could be about 30 years. So then therefore you take that money that would be a $20,000 roof, divide it in half, then you can subtract that price from the purchase price if you were to buy a different version of that home. Does that make sense? You can do the same thing with water heater, appliances, etc. Take that value and divide from there. How can you estimate repairs? That's something that can be tricky, where if you've only done one deal, you've maybe not done any, how do you actually estimate what those repairs might cost, and if there's a difference between you doing it yourself versus someone else doing it? And if someone else is doing the repair, how do you factor in that cost? And is it better for you to do it or someone else to do it? Generally, the rule of thumb is that whatever the cost of the item is, it's about that same cost to have it installed. So if a toilet costs X amount of dollars, to have that same toilet installed is about that much money. So just go to your Home Depot, look at what the cost of all of the stuff is, and then just double that. That's kind of an easy rule of thumb, because it's one of the most tricky things. Moving on from repairs and CapEx, looking at your net operating income, because your net operating income will be used in several different ways. And what does that mean? You're taking your gross income. Okay, but what does gross income actually mean? That just means your total amount of money. So gross is everything. Think of it like icky. I want that. Your net is then after that. That's kind of how I look at it. So you take all the money that you're bringing in, and then you subtract out your operating expenses. And that's how you get your net operating income. The net operating income will be helpful later. But how do you then calculate your operating expenses? You're sitting near your computer, you're walking through a home, you're trying to decide, how do I actually value this deal? That's where I would use something like the 50% rule. And that's the estimate of your operating expenses. So if you were to be looking and a home says that it's a multifamily place and there's 4 units and there's an average rent of $1,500 across all those units, that's where you would just take 50% of that and assume that's what your operating expenses would take out. So let's say that that's 1,500 times 4, but actually we can just do the 50% rule. That would be about $3,000. So that $3,000 would be in here for your operating expenses. Therefore, you can get your NOI. And then taking your NOI, that is helpful because you're able to plug that into something else, like your cap rate. If you're online and you hear these people talking about the cap rate of different properties, what does that actually mean? The cap rate is important for a few different reasons. One, understanding where this investment lines up with your other ones. Because what does one deal look like if you don't have comparison of something else? You can make $1,000 a year. $1,000 a year could be great. But if you could also be making $5,000 a year, what is better? That's kind of how you can look at it. You can take that net operating income, divide it by your value. And different properties have different rates in which they generally flow into. Where something like a short-term rental can have a higher cap rate, you make more money. Generally, the higher the cap rate, the better the investment is. A short-term rental can have a higher cap rate than a long-term rental, but you then have more expenses, more things that go on. So that doesn't necessarily mean great. You can also do something like a value add to increase that cap rate, where you buy something maybe at a 4 or 5% cap rate. You do some upgrades, do some things, blah, blah, blah. Read anything about value add, go online. There's many different, if I make this on YouTube, go to the video description. There'll be a link with some different articles about some value add, but that's a quick key thing. One of the other metrics that comes up quite often for me day to day with my clients is they care about their cash on cash return. What does cash on cash return? You can also call it your COC, C-O-C, not Clash of Clans. It's your annual cash flow divided by your cash invested. And that's really what people tend to care about, is what does that money that's coming out of their pocket actually look like divided by their annual cash flow, meaning how much money is coming in. That doesn't take into consideration what your expenses might be, but it is a good metric. That's something that clients of mine always tend to look at. Another good metric is your IRR or your APY, and that's helpful looking at multiple different deals, syndication projects, multifamily. It's not just one home in particular, because it's not something that I can write out as do X, do Y. It's something that you have to have a spreadsheet, and you're only as good as what the inputs that you put in. Make sense? And going on from that, tying off with the cap rate is your property value. And that's where the two of these are really helpful, of having your cap rate and your property value, because then you can find your value of a property based on the cap rate. If you know that you have 2 investments and you know the cap rate of one and you would like for this property to do better than that one, you just take whatever that cap rate is and then divide it by your NOI. So that's something that can be used to create that property value, rather than sitting there and thinking, man, how am I going to value this property? It's different for a single family home versus a multifamily, because a multifamily, commercial, etc., is generally valued more on the income that it brings in. A single family home is different. There's different ways to go about it. So therefore, 4 questions to ask yourself to evaluate a deal. Question 1, how much money will be made from this? And that's where you look at things like your profit, your NOI, your cash flow. Okay? That can be helpful, but you also miss out on a lot of information. So, second question, what percentage of my initial dollar how much money will be made, what percentage will be made for my initial dollar. That is your ROI, your equity multiplier. Equity multiplier, whatever. ROI is a little easier. You can also do an annualized ROI where you take your return on investment of how much money you're making versus how much money you put in. And that will then give you a number. And you can say, oh, well, if I'm going to hold it for X amount of years, then you can kind of see what that annualized ROI is. The bad thing about an annualized ROI is that by doing that, you might have expenses that come up in your first year that are different. Like each year can be totally different. So if you were to decide, oh, after 2 years, I'm going to sell this, it can look a lot different. Does that make sense? Third question, what percentage of your initial dollar will be returned each year? That is where your cap rate and cash on cash come back in. People, again, what money are you spending? How is that money coming back out? What does that look like each year? Can be helpful. And then fourth question, what is your compounded return over time? Again, that is for things bigger than just one single deal. Generally, that's where you look at something like your IRR because you're able to have more information all coming in. There's a lot of different things, a lot of different variables. I think it's really interesting. The time value of money is something that's very interesting if you own a home and you're trying to decide how to sell it. Generally, everybody wants to make the most out of their investment, so they want to list it higher than what it actually might be. But what is that value of that home selling today versus that home selling 3 months from now? Because you're going to have other expenses. Not only are you going to have inflation chipping away at your money, you're also going to have things like your operating expenses, how much it costs to have the lights turned on every day, the water, etc., your insurance, your taxes. You could be moving somewhere else. You could be downsizing. You could be doing something else. And that's then what is the value of that money in the future pulled back into today? That's where you can do something like a discounted cash flow analysis. You could also do something besides a discounted cash flow analysis like a expected value formula, where if I expect a 30% chance that this will happen or a 40% chance that will happen and I'll make these different dollars. There's more to go into it, but this is something that I think is really helpful to start out, and we can make more videos about this. What do you think? If you made it all the way through this video, comment the word house. Thank you so much for watching. Do you have any questions? Leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys later.